All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And as I just told the group here, we're going to talk a little bit about Armenian American genealogy. Being Armenian, we probably have ancestors from all over different parts of the world. So it's not one size fits all, but we're going to start with some American-based ones to see how Armenians show up in the U.S. public record. So as you can see here, this is from Project Save, which if you don't know about already is an incredible resource of they are a collection warehouse basically of Armenian photos from all different places all over the world, and they really encourage you to donate your collections as well because as I've come to realize, over the decades, even when people don't want to part with their photos, it's a family heirloom, but they don't know about the next generations and what they're going to do. And unfortunately, more times than not, things end up in the trash. So it's always good to keep in mind aspects like this of, what will we do with this? Because I can tell you, I've, stumbled across things in their archives that have really helped me coming from people they donated 20, 30 years ago. They're not alive anymore for me to talk to, but Project Save actually interviews you and takes down whatever information you can give them about the photos, and then that stays in their archives. So researchers like me can come along in decades or a century later and find some of this stuff. So, I mean, things like this is just great. This photo, you can all see the photo, I think, hopefully for screen sharing of this very Victorian looking Armenian family. They were actually in St. Louis, Missouri, which is not a place you usually associate with many Armenians. But going back to the earliest days, I found Armenians that were living in Missouri, in Oklahoma, in Texas, way back in the 1900 and around those years. So even today we have certain places like California or New York and Massachusetts that we always associate with Armenians. There's basically always been Armenians everywhere. So uh, this is a quote about the situation of the genealogist's plight, I'll call it, because as Armenians, we most of us have ancestry in modern day Turkey to some degree. Even if you're from Armenia more recently, modern Armenia, many, many, many people in modern Armenia have ancestors that were in Eastern Turkey that got pushed into what is now Armenia. So almost all of us have ancestry from there at some point. And that means it's basically impossible for us to do genealogy because we don't have access to any records back there. And we've just always kind of assumed that everything was destroyed in the genocide. So, as George Arjayan says, he is a very dedicated genealogist. If you're involved in anything Armenian genealogy, you've heard of him probably. He said the majority of Armenians are under the mistaken belief that all pre-genocide Armenian records have been destroyed and that little can be learned about their personal ancestry beyond what has been handed down through oral tradition. It is undoubtedly true that most pre-1915 Armenian church records were destroyed either during the genocide or in the years since. In addition, few genocide survivors were able or willing to recount their experiences or their family lineage, but that is not the complete story. So that really well sums up our issues. I talk to so many people who say, I wish I had asked, my grandmother and my, whoever they knew that was left in their family from the older generation. But many people admit when they were younger, they didn't really care about it, or it just wasn't a thing that really, crossed their mind to talk about. And in addition, many say that their grandmothers, wouldn't talk about it. It was too painful, and they had lost many family members, maybe that even died in front of them in violent ways. And so, with trauma, that's not an easy thing to recount. There's always some people are all open to talking about it all the time as their way of coping with it, and many who just never talk about it. So that is our problem. In some families, you might have been lucky enough to have a past generation genealogist. I think on most sides, not all, but most sides of my family, at least a couple of different sides, there was always that one relative who kind of went around asking everybody about the family trees, though I must admit the ones that did had left before the genocide, or were living in Istanbul at the time of the genocide, so they didn't suffer as badly. And so maybe that also had something to do with it. It was easier to remember the old days and what it was like back there, uh, without the really heavy memories. Uh, but let's see. So I'm going to move on to the next one to talk about phases of Armenian immigration to America. So as I was alluding, I had some earlier generations that were here that kind of did some of the family tree research for me. And without that, I would not have been able to connect many of the branches that I have today. Uh, Phase one, as I call it, were pre-1895. Now, if you know Armenian history, you know 1895 era were the Hamidian massacres done by Sultan Abdul Hamid against the Armenian populations and killed hundreds of thousands. This was not the genocide. This was before the genocide, but it was what many say a precursor. So the ones prior to that were usually Armenians that had some sort of connection with Protestant missionaries. There were many Protestant missionaries entering the Ottoman Empire since the 1830s, 40s, and they were not allowed to convert Muslims. So they went and basically went to the other Christian groups that were there, but they weren't Protestant groups. And so they kind of just said, we're going to convert them to the true path instead of the Armenian church. And they would identify intelligent ones amongst them, the most promising ones, and send them back to America to attend schools, universities. Some became doctors, some became yeah, we had doctors and preachers in great numbers. So those are kind of pioneers, and also some merchants. Merchants as well would come sometimes temporarily, sometimes longer periods, or people that were had some sort of skill or trade, and they wanted to try their luck in America. So there were hundreds of these people. But overall, when it comes to how far you can trace your ancestry back, most of these people have become totally assimilated to the point where they might not even know they have Armenian ancestors unless they do this. Phase two is 1895 to I guess 1914, you could say. Uh, that is the early formation of Armenian communities. So the first Armenian church ever in America was in Worcester, 1893. So that is just the tail end of that pre-1895 period, the phase one. As phase one is ending, we go into phase two. Phase two had a lot of people that have realized, all right, after the Hamidian massacres, they survived it or heard about it if it didn't directly affect them, and they realized, I need to get out of here. They also, the conditions in inner Armenia, let's say, outside of Istanbul, in the villages, was becoming more and more untenable. There were huge levels of taxation, levels of oppression from the Kurdish neighbors, and Circassians were being moved in. They had been kicked out of Russia and were coming in and settling in Turkey, and the Turkish government was purposely settling them in Armenian villages. Meanwhile, the men were not able to make a living there because of all the various oppressions. Many of them started becoming migrant workers. So the men were leaving the villages, and these, strangers, let's say, that might have been hostile to Armenians, were getting moved into the villages that were just mostly women and children. So it was a very dangerous situation. So men were realizing we have to get our families out of there if we can. They're going to, besides migrant working in the cities like Istanbul, some were then going further afield to America to do that as well. And then as they made money, they would send for their wives and children. And so those are the people that became those early families in phase two. Also, at the tail end of phase two, I did 1914 because it's the beginning of World War One. But really, let's say 1913, there was a huge rush of Armenian men leaving the Ottoman Empire in 1912 and 13, especially 13, because for the first time ever, Armenians were not being exempted from the Ottoman draft anymore. Up until that time, being Christian subjects, they didn't even want to give them weapons anyway, so to speak. And so they made Armenians pay a tax to avoid military service. And so, I mean, I guess in some ways that was good for Armenians. And as we know, when Armenians did have to serve in the military, they would often be, it was just an excuse to kill them. But, and they knew that what was possibly going to happen in the 1912, 1913 conscription for the Balkan Wars. So, and I know in my own family, there's a couple of them that went off and never returned. And, does that mean they were killed in battle or they killed themselves? Don't really know. But a lot of young men got out. The families that could got them out, which ended up protecting them from the genocide. They didn't know that was coming, but they got out at just the right time. So they were sent away. And then the next phase, I started 1915, but really people weren't getting out of the Ottoman Empire at that time because World War One had stopped most of the ship transits except for way in the north. They had some leaving from Norway to America because that was kind of out of the main range of the German U-boats and all that. But generally, people weren't traveling until World War One ended, 1918, 1919, 20. And so that was a huge wave of survivors because there were all those men or young men who had been sent to America in 1913 and then lost all contact with their family for the next 5 years. And so there was this big rush of, trying to figure out who's left. Did anyone survive? Do I have any relatives out there? And they saw out many ways of trying to get in contact with whatever networks they had over there. And some people were able to get connected to either their family who survived, or even if it was one relative or one niece or one even more distant relative, they found whoever they could and then allowed them to come to America because you needed someone to sponsor you. And having been in America for about 5 years at that point, at 5 years, you can put in your papers for naturalization and become a citizen. So once you're a citizen, you have even more ability to get your family over if your family survived. But there was only a small window for that. So like we said, 1919 is when it started. But then by 1924, there were very racist and restrictionist quota laws that went into effect that just cut off all ability for people to get it. So then that was a lockdown, basically, as I call it. If a citizen, so if Armenian was a citizen, they could get their relative in if it was a direct, like a parent or a child. They still had the ability to get around the quotas. But other than that, if you hadn't gotten in and you didn't have an immediate relative in America, you're not getting it, which is why many people's ancestors then ended up going in other directions. Because, all right, so survivors from the genocide went to mainly Istanbul or to Aleppo. And then they had those years to connect with their family members, if they have any in America, and get there. Once that door closed, then, that's kind of is what solidified the Armenian communities in Syria and Lebanon because they were basically stuck there. At least they couldn't get to America anymore. And then others turned the other way and looked to Soviet Armenia and said, well, we can't get into America now. We're going to go for the homeland. And so then the fourth phase, 1925 to the 50s, is America is kind of locked down, but that starts to change with World War II. Refugees started coming, for example, ones who had been behind, well, they'd been in Russia. The Germans moved in, and then some to escape the Soviet Union kind of retreated with the Germans, or they were refugees. They had lost their homes in the war and they ended up in Eastern Europe. Thousands and thousands of Armenians ended up in Germany and other places like that as a result of just they basically lost their homes during the war and were refugees in their own right. And places like Montebello in the LA area was a major emigration point for these Russian kind of Armenians have been living in the Russian area for the most part. And so we see this influx of Eastern Armenians, maybe not for the first time, because there's Evergreen Cemetery out there. That's how I kind of made my first connection with the library, transcribing some stones that are in that cemetery in Los Angeles. and they date to the 1920s and 30s in by and large. And you can read on the stones they were from Alexanderpol, which is modern day Gyumri, a lot from Gars in the very, very edge, right outside Gyumri and other parts of like Shirak region of modern Armenia. And they were in the Los Angeles area by the 20s and 30s. And so maybe that's a reason why so many of these Russianized Armenians ended up in Montebello. I'm not sure, or maybe it was where they were sent, because a lot of times with refugees, you were sent where you're sent, and you have no say in that. But that was an influx. World War II refugees. The 1950s to the 80s, we saw lots of Middle Eastern conflicts. And so we had Egypt, for example, overthrew the king, and it became more of an Egypt for Egyptians. Armenians were kind of pushed out. They didn't feel safe there anymore. There was all kinds of upheavals in the 70s and 80s, like the civil war in Lebanon. Many Syrian Armenians came. We had the revolution in Iran. So many Persian Armenians came. So we saw big influxes in that sense. So meanwhile, the Armenian Americans of today kind of date to the phase two and phase three. Then we have phase four with kind of some of the Soviet refugee Armenians. Then we have phase five, a lot of the Middle Eastern Armenians who might have had distant relatives that were here from the earlier phases, but hadn't gotten out. And so that's when they got out. And then the sixth phase, 80s to the present, post-Soviet immigration wave. Of course, we all know the Soviet Union fell, and we had the whole influx, which has made Glendale the Armenian center that it is today. So that's a history. This is a document from phase one, as I'll call it. This is, you can see, it says, I, Christopher Oskanian, do solemnly and something swear that I am a citizen of the United States and having been naturalized in the city. It's not the easiest one to read, but it's dated 1857. Christopher Oskanian, age 42, 5 feet tall, 11 and a half inches, and describes what he looks like. This is a passport request. So this is an Armenian. He's one of the real pioneer. That's why I wanted to include him. He's one of the first Armenians in America that we know of. It's possible there were ones in the 1700s or even before. They say there was Martin the Armenian in the 1600s and a couple others. And in the 1700s, there were some family stories that their ancestor was an Armenian that came, but we don't really have much documentation on them. We do have a little bit on the 1600s, those couple of 1600 guys, but we don't know what happened to them. But Christopher Oskanian, we'd say in the modern age of immigration, was one of the very first Armenians to come here. So it's just a look at an 1857 Armenian and what his document looks like. Now, this document is from, it's a ship manifest. And as we're going to learn, ship manifests are very important in tracing your family history. This one was from about 1854, I believe, going to the port of Boston from Constantinople. And you can see on the list, the second one says Paul, I don't know, it's Agarian, Esquire, even. And then the next one, it might even be Armenian. It's really hard to read. Goldsmith. And we have a Garabedian. And we have John Arakelian. And then another, looks like Hampartsumian. Then Minas Garabedian, Thomas Garabedian, and Melian Garabedian. The last two are engineers. So these are passengers coming to Boston in the 1850s, and you see they're all Armenians. So this is, again, phase one. And I use this one because I had done a project on marking the grave of the only Armenian Civil War officer, you could call him. He was a naval officer in the U.S. Civil War. There were other Armenian doctors who served. And so, I mean, it's not that he was the only Armenian in the Civil War, but he was an officer as an engineer, and his name was Khachagor. So he's one of these last two because he was an engineer. Age-wise, they're too close to tell which one's him because he used different years, but could have been Thomas, for example. But this is his emigration to Massachusetts, and he ended up staying here, and he died in my city of Philadelphia in 1881. Here is another look at something from a little bit later. This is a census, and you can see, oh, actually, not a census, sorry. This is the enrollment list, June 1863. We have down there, number 18, Garabed Hachadur, age 28, machinist, born in Armenia. These are men enlisting in the Civil War, and that is him. This is in Lowell, Massachusetts, where many Armenians were working in the mills, and he ended up joining the war, became a citizen, and then when he ended the war here in Philadelphia, was discharged here, and ended up staying here, married a woman from an old Philadelphia family. Her great 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 grandfather was an associate of Ben Franklin, and I always thought it was very interesting to imagine what that family life was like. And there's an Armenian guy when no one knew what Armenians were over here, married to this old Philadelphia family. But this is another example of if you had our ancestors that went back that far, something that would be very helpful. This is a Quaker record for Frank Normart. He married the Gardner. Her maiden name was Gardner, his wife, married a non-Armenian, of course, because there were almost no Armenians here. And he and another Armenian, they came from Erzurum, you can see over there. His wife, born in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and these are their children, born in Philadelphia. Quakers took excellent records. They were very, very meticulous about that. And so we have information. And if you notice his name, Normart, it's not an IAN last name. His last name was Yanikyan. But the story is he arrived in America and said, I'm a new man arriving here, which in Armenian is Normart. So that is how the family got that name. It's a kind of interesting one. And I put him as well because he's really the father of California Armenians. He is said to be the first Armenian to ever go to California, as far as we know. Again, we can't know for sure. But he ended up in the Fresno area in 1876 and became just like, wow, this place is amazing. It reminds me of the homeland. And he came back to Philadelphia where he had settled and told his family members about it. And they started moving out there. So ended up his parents went out to Fresno, his siblings, and some other Armenians as well that they were spreading the word, and that is how Fresno started as the Armenian center that it is. And then I can only imagine that spread out to Los Angeles and the very early Armenians. There were ones there in 1900s, very early 1900s, and now there's been a steady stream of them, and now there's a huge amount of them. But it goes all the way back to 1876 in Frank Normart. So it used to be very difficult to track down all the sources for Armenian genealogy, but now we have US records all in one place. So I'm going to show you in a minute. Some of those include, these are important, birth, death, and marriage records, censuses, military records, naturalization records, passports, ship manifests, and very interesting ones, Gupandrem ads, which I'll show you. So I'm going to do a new share with the website so we can look over this website and how it can help. Just 1 second as I get there. Yeah, or you might already see it. All right, you should see a website now. This is Armenian Immigration Project at the top. This is the website of Mark Arslan, who has done an incredible amount. I mean, millions of hours. I don't think it could actually be millions, but pretty close to that. An incredible amount of time transcribing records of Armenians coming to America. It started off with immigration records on the ships, and it is spread to different types of records. So as you can see here, he has a rotating number of photos from the different records that he finds. Every month or so, it seems to update to new ones. But if you go to this website, it's on markarslan.org. I just Google easiest Mark Arslan genealogy, Arslan, Arslan. Google Mark Arslan genealogy to get to the website. And so where you want to go is it's under projects and reports. There's a button. I think it takes you to an earlier page with a button, but you push projects and reports, takes you to this page. And now you'll see different types. So the one that is the most your best chance of finding stuff because it has the most records in it are the ship manifests. So you can search it by birthplace, by the destination date, by the port that they were going to, by the name of who they were joining, by the last name of the person, the immigrant, by the origin port where they left, by the passenger's last name. There's tons of different ways. Birthplace, for example. Now that one can be really convenient if even if you don't have an immediate ancestor who came through Ellis Island or any other forms, because it wasn't just Ellis Island, they went through a lot of different other ports. Uh, you might have ancestries from a certain place. Like it automatically goes to Sivas, for example. And then within Sivas, there's a lot of villages as well, or just the main city, Sivas, or Tokat, for example. All right, we're just going to click on Tokat. Let's say you don't have any that came immediately here, but you can still look through everyone who said they're from Tokat that are currently in the database. Mark has not yet transcribed every single ship manifest that there is. There's still a lot more to do, but there are already tens of thousands of names in this. So you look through it, you say, okay, let's say I have Kurkjian. I'm just making this up. I don't know if they'll be there or not. But let's say I have Kurkjian relatives from Tokat, which I do actually. So you can go down and note how this one is organized is uh, the names are done by, he groups them together. So like here, Herion, he says, well, that's probably not an Armenian last name, this Herion. He organizes under Aroyan. So it actually comes up with the A, which there it's a little bit, I don't know, but here, for example, Tihobanya. Well, the T, that's probably a C, makes Chulbanyan. So he puts it under Chulbanyan. So even though it begins with the T, it ends up under CH. So it can be a little bit tricky that way, but it actually helps because the worst thing for Armenians trying to find in a regular search is that their last names were probably transcribed 5,000 different ways, and you have no idea how, what you're looking for. So this gives you that little extra nudge where there were a couple of people that I could not find no matter what. And it was only through Mark's site and his ability to, kind of, look at all of them and kind of sort them out that I was able to finally find them. But I was looking on the Ellis Island site for years and years and years and never finding them. So let's go down looking for Kirkchum, by the way, just in case. Nope, don't have them in here as far as I can see, but let's say you're Melkonian. We've got that right there. We have Mesropian, which is under Mesropian. So that way you just have to look up one name, Mesropian. If you do it by last name, it will bring up everyone, Mesropian, Mesropian. Let's look at that. So besides doing it by place of birth, and by the way, earlier ones, if it's before like 1910, they don't list birthplace. So you don't always want to do it by birthplace, but it's very helpful. You know what villages your relatives are from. Just look up the birthplace and look at down everyone. You might find some distant relatives, people sharing the same last name. But now let's do passenger name. And they have regular, which is everyone's last name just in order, however it's spelled, or STD, meaning standardized, which is his standardized version of the names are, kind of grouped together. So here, for example, I'll highlight it. Aslanian, Oslanian. And then, so yeah, you wouldn't look up Oslanian probably when you're doing it. But he brings it together here. So while you're looking through the Aslanians, you find Oslanian as well. Go down further. Oh, here's another one. He's really on top of it. John Lyon. What does Arslan mean? It means lion. So he actually has John Lyon, who Americanized his name, listed here under the Arslanians. So that even more like really gives you that help. And we can look over here. This is by last name. We have birthplace. Kayseri, Malatya, Harput, Kayseri. So, okay, we've got two Kayseris. So in that case, if you did it by birth, place and you type in Kayseri, those two guys would show up. But like I said, not everyone even has a birthplace listed, or sometimes birthplace is like a generalized area, like Harput is listed for people from many villages around Harpert, and you might not think of yourself as being from Harpert, but it was grouped under that. So it's best to kind of do both, looking at by birthplace, but then also last name. And here's just an example of what you can find under it. This little, the green magnifying glass, we'll just click on a random one, and it brings us to, all right, this is Arantu, which it could be Haruchun, for example, or something else like it. It gives you the ship's name, the date it left, where it left, Constantinople, where it was going, New York. He was in steerage, age 40, male that was married, laborer, his height, the birthplace, doesn't Kidashin, which could be Kedashin, Russia. Now, again, Russia back then meant all of what is the modern South Caucasus. So, for example, I know, we all, many of us might know from the Karabakh conflict, there is the song Kedashin. That doesn't mean it's the same village, but it would be considered Russia at that time, even though it's present day Azerbaijan, because that was all the Russian Empire. Last residence, Constantinople. So at some point, he left his home village in the Caucasus, presumably, and went to Constantinople. They usually would have gone to the Georgian ports, for example, Batumi, or maybe even Trabzon, taken the boat to Constantinople. And we don't know, maybe he stayed there a year, many years, maybe it was only a week, and he got on the ship to go to New York from Constantinople. He had a brother, J. Arslanian, coincidentally, living in Los Angeles, 517 South Pecan Street. It says in California 4 years. That could mean, sometimes it gives actual years, and that would make it more clear. It says in California from 1910 to 1914. That means they were in the US before, they went back, and now they're going again. So we might have another record for this guy. We looked into it closer, where he came the first time. And you'll see these blue links under other people. So here, brother J. Arslanian, you click on this link, and it takes you to the ship manifest of his brother when he came in 1912. He went from Liverpool in England to Philadelphia. He was steerage. His name, so here it's Alexander. So you can see how Mark has really dived deep to figure out who's who, which is really amazing when you consider how many thousands of people are in this. Because it said J, but maybe Alexander changed his name in America to be John or something like that. And here we see birthplace is listed as Alexandropol Bekant. So that would be a village outside of Gumri. And many of the names have changed by now, so you might take a little bit of deep diving to discover what Bekant is today, but you can, trace him back now to a specific place. Wife, again, the name is, very hard to read, the way that it wasn't really able to transcribe it. Nuensam, I don't know, Noemzad, for example. I'm not sure, but maybe you could find other records that give you more information. And when he came to Baba Nom Tatos. So Tateos, Babayan, maybe this is how he did it. Those are not always correct, those bracket names, but he's, Baba, okay, it's probably Babayan or something. Oh, and look, again, total coincidence, but St. Louis, Missouri. I didn't plan this, but there's more Armenians in St. Louis. So it gives you all the details on him coming over and any other time he might be listed. So we have 1923, aha. So Aruntun, who we already looked at, also came with Leon, another relative. And then down here, we have, this one is Alexander's declaration of intention. This is his declaration, intention to become a citizen, 1922. So again, born Alexandropol, he's a driver, immigrated from Libau, Russia, arrived at Philadelphia, like we saw. Aha. Here's his spouse's name again. Aslanyan Novemza, which is getting closer sounding to Noemzan. So maybe I was right about her name. And then comments, known as Jim Aslanyan. There's the J. So that's how we brought it all together. J is actually Alexander. And we find out that his wife is alive. But she's in Constantinople as of 1922. If we look further into it, maybe we'll find her. Maybe, though usually there might be a link to her that I don't see one immediately, but doesn't mean that there isn't one. But yeah, this stuff down here gives you all more information. Oh yeah, here's auto tunes, by the way. Same thing. He shows up in a census, the 1930 census. Let's look at that. He's head of a household, comes from Russia. His wife, Bart, age 50. Year of immigration, 1927. So remember, he came 1924. He actually came 23 for the record. But the census, they're writing things down. They don't always get it exact. 1924. So you got to re-verify everything. Never go exactly by what it says. You got to kind of get two or three. And then he has, well, this is interesting. He has a son, Mike, age 10, 1927, and a new daughter, 6 months. But he says his wife is 50. If she's 50, she's probably too old to have a child. So is the 50 wrong? That's possible. Or is she adopted? I mean, I don't know. We'd have to look more into this family. But again, this is just an example of the rabbit holes you can go down. By the way, they were living 1447 Downey Road, Belvedere in East Los Angeles. A lot of Armenians of that time came to East Los Angeles. And oh, just like I mentioned, again, this all comes full circle. I did not plan this at all, but like I told you, there were a lot of Gumri Armenians found at the Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles. And who are these people? They're Gumri Armenians. So there you go. This is just an example of that was just a little bit. I mean, we could do this forever. But that is an example of the stuff you can get from ship manifests. And it also kind of coincided with census records. Uh, Here's passport, which is always interesting. You could do by court location, last name, passport send to, where are you sending what address were you sending it to? So like, for example, let's see who's in California. Now, passport is one of them where they don't have nearly as many transcribed as the immigration. So don't think because it's not here, it doesn't exist. You can also look up these on Ancestry by last name, but let's just see out of the few that we have on here. You can organize by state. So we'll do California. And for Los Angeles, we have Fifth Street, we have South Olive Street, Security Savings Bank, and Figueroa Street. We have Oakland, Fresno, Fowler. I mean, there were definitely more than these, but just to get an idea of who these people are. All right, the oath date, 1924 here, 1891, out in Fresno, of course, they were the earliest ones. The Los Angeles, we have a 1915 and 1914. He's from Kayseri. One's from Constantinople. Donchian, that's Donjian. And another hint, middle names are often the father's name. So that's really helped when I have not been able to find the father's name anywhere else. But if they use a middle name consistently, and if it's, especially it's one written out like that, Dikran, there's a very good chance his father's name was Dikran. Yeah, you can't be 100% certain of it, but it gives you a good idea, especially if he has a child and his child is named Dikran. It was a tradition to name, for the father to name his son after his father. So you see a lot of cases of the same name rotating each generation. So go, Paul Dikran, Paul Dikran, Paul Dikran, all the way down. So that is, again, another idea. Now, just one more interesting one, because we're running out of time that I want to go over. I mentioned the Dupandrem Acts. So those were a function of the post-genocide years, where there's all those men in America looking for their relatives if they survived. So they were putting them into Armenian newspapers all over the world saying, do you know so-and-so? Have you seen them? And what an amazing genealogical resource that many of us hadn't realized even existed. As you think of, okay, birth records, death records, but here are all these Armenian newspapers, And there's many, many more across the world that have not been touched. Just imagine how much information could be out there. But Mark has been going to the Hayrenik in particular, and also another one, Corriere da Sart Hayastan. And here's a whole list just for the name Vartanian. That's the one he defaults to, but there's lots of last names, as you can see. The role is, were they mentioned in the ad, or did they place the ad? And then it has origin location, where the person was living, and when it was published. So let's pick a random one. Okay, this Karakin Dervartanian, Hamilton, Ontario. He was from Kerry in Erzurum province. Looks like it was in WY. That would mean Wyoming, which is, again, like I said, there are meanings everywhere. And then they actually have a picture of the ad. Găpân Druvi, Hachik Dervartanian, Curry, Țermag, Cureți, Wyoming, Nahanki, Mech, Elal, Gardzavi. So he's actually, this is kind of rare. He's looking for Hachik Dervartanian, his relative, who was in Wyoming last he heard of. It's not a case of he was lost in a genocide. It's last I knew, my relative was out in Wyoming. I haven't had word from him for a while. Please let me know if you've heard from him. I'm in Hamilton, Ontario, which is nowhere near Wyoming. So that's the more kind of unique one. A lot of them are unfortunately, very tragic. Let's see this. Looking for Yachpidus, Yerzengai, Zat Gyoren, Dikran, and then he has Vartan, Antigian, Antigian, Naev, Bedros, Dikran, Voltigian, Yerzingai, and so on. So, I mean, they list out who they're looking for. This is the person placing the ad. We'll go to his. He's looking for Musherian Vartan, Dikran Antigian, Petros Veltigian, and then so he was looking for them in 1919. Notice how two of them have the green view. So this is perhaps good luck. It means they might have been discovered because we go to Musherian, let's see. Oh, nothing. No extra link. Oh, wait. Yeah, here we go. You go to his page, Musha Vartanyan, mentioned in ad. You click on this, and 1913. Oh, actually, so 1913, he had come to America at least. And then we have military registration. He registered to be in World War I in 1918. And then we have his death record, 1923. So you can kind of follow through his entire life. That's another one who might have been in America instead of in the genocide. But there's tons of ones, people looking for their family. So, and that's just the name Vartanian. So look up the names that you're looking for and just go through it. Just here, Shema Vonyan. Let's see who shows up. But anyway, you can look by, all right, not many, but we have Kelly and Vaughn. So these two, probably the same ad. Yeah, same date. This is someone, probably a different family altogether because it's Vaughn, which is not close at all. But there you go. So I'm going to spend the last few minutes. This is, the amazingness of this page. I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes going back to the presentation. And we're going to talk about, all right, there's Mark's stuff. Genealogy outside the US.
Paul, real quick. Can I
yeah.
interrupt? There was a question in chat that I missed, and I also had a question, so I'm going to throw it out there. One of your previous slides of the enlistment for the Civil War, there were a lot of the names were crossed out. What did that mean?
Yeah, I was wondering that myself, because I would have said, maybe they enlisted and then were lost track of or something, but our Hachador Garabedian was actually one of them crossed out. And we know that he enlisted and that he served. So I'm not 100% sure what's going on with this. But we even have, details about them. They were in the 14th Regiment. They were in the 33rd Regiment. So it's not that they didn't show up. I don't know why these are crossed out. But again, it's another mystery, which there might be some meaning behind it that if you look into it deeper, you could figure out. But when I saw it, I was like, oh no, he's crossed out. But it was too good not to use, so I had to use it. So genealogy outside the U.S. This is kind of an overview of the possible resources that we have that you might not realize that we have. So Ottoman population registers are available to the public for the 1820s to 1846. They were doing censuses of the families. I've looked through the 1846 one, for example, and George Aljayan, for example, has a bunch of these for villages that he has relatives from. He's gotten them from the Ottoman archives. They are available. You can get the copies, but you have to learn how to read Ottoman. That's the tricky thing. It's an Arabic type script, which almost nobody knows how to read anymore, though there are a few who can. So that makes it even harder. Not only do you have to get it from the Ottoman archives, but you also have to know how to read it, which is a whole nother level. But if anyone has a relative from Arapgir, like I do, there is a researcher who has published a book where he translated the census registries for Arapgir, Armenians and non-Armenians, for those years. And so I've gone to 1846 one because that's the closest we have to the modern day. It still is behind, we call it that like Armenia, that brick wall that we run into, where the genocide is like, I guess it's kind of the reason for the brick wall, but we are the product of survivors of the genocide for the most part. So the survivors were able to tell us maybe their parents' names, maybe their grandparents, but then that's it. So if they were born around 1900, that means their parents were born probably 1880s or 70s and their grandparents 1850s or 60s. So we're really close, but not close enough. We just need one more of those censuses to be made public, but we can't quite get there. So when I look through it, I recognized very few people, though a lot of the last names I did recognize, and a lot of last names I didn't, which was kind of strange. I was like, who are these? These names don't even sound Armenian. They were very, very strange names, which, I mean, which we can only assume they changed it in the couple of decades to come to whatever name the family, was known by during the genocide time and later on. Because all these unknown names that didn't seem to be Turkish, they didn't seem to be Armenian, don't know what they're about. But a lot of the names were ones I recognized, and the families are really big. It will go by household. We divide it up by neighborhoods. And then there's also a census of survivors in Arapgir in 1919. And what's interesting is you can see like some of the same family last names. They were living in one neighborhood in 1846, and they're still living in the same neighborhood in 1919. So there's that interesting continuity. And I found one or two people. It was a 90-year-old in the 1919 census who was a young child in the 1846 census. So there was one or two overlappings of survivors, though many of them in that census of 1846, if they were alive, probably were killed in 1915. But it was just really interesting to find that evidence of, yeah, like this is all true. Like we see the same name, same guy in the two records. So anyway, Turkey has remained the rest of the census records and also birth records from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Those are all state secrets. We cannot see them. We can't get to them, unfortunately. But hopefully there's signs that that's changing, because you might have heard some years ago, Turkey released all this new website. It's now 5, 6 years old, but anyone with a Turkish social security number could go to the website, type it in, and it would give you your family tree going back in those records as far as they had. And unfortunately, as descendants of people from there, we don't have Turkish social security numbers, so we cannot unlock our information. But the fact that they opened it up to the Turkish public, and again, people speculate what were the reasons, these theories of, are they trying to let everyone know, hey, you might not be as Turkish as you think you are because people were finding Armenian type names in those answers. You know, there was a lot of controversy behind that, but hopefully some more will be released. I spoke to one person who he was in Turkey, and he said back in the 50s or 60s when he was registering for the military, he said they took me to a room and they showed me, they unrolled this big scroll and it had my entire family going back generations. And he said, those are all, state secrets. We can't see them. But he said, as descendants of the genocide, at the very least, as a matter of reparations, we deserve to know who our ancestors were. And so this information does exist even today, even though we think everything was destroyed and many Armenian records were destroyed, not everything is gone. So there's reason for hope. Um, there are various sacramental records and censuses from Istanbul. If you go to the website Hushamadian, Houshmadyan, I believe, it's a great resource. And under Istanbul, they have a few of those censuses. One was like 1909 or so, and they list who are the Armenians living. It's not a complete census by any means. It's not every Armenian living in Istanbul, but I did find a couple people that I knew were living there that showed up in it. So there's some stuff there you can get on Hushamadian. It also has the Arapgir list of the 1919 census. So they do have some interesting information there.
I think I put it in the chat. I hope that's
Yep, it's in the chat ring now.
Yeah.
And you
Lisa
mentioned
asked
modern
a question,
Armenian.
Paul?
Oh,
I'm monitoring chat. Lisa asked a question. If you could just
yeah, just saw that.
Okay.
So modern Armenia and old Armenia, the way that I would do that is so modern Armenia is the current borders of Armenia, the state. However, a huge amount of Armenians do not have any ancestry from there. When people ask me, oh, you have relatives in Armenia? No, I really don't. I have nobody from there. And so it's kind of that funny thing for Armenians, many of us Western Armenians, where Armenia is our homeland, but it's not where our ancestors are from. So like, how is it your homeland if your ancestors aren't from there? It's all we have left, basically. Most of Turkey was where the Armenians were living at the time of the genocide. And many people consider Van, Kars, places that were, ripped away because of military attack in the 1915, 1918, 1920 period. That was part of the original, the first independent Armenia in 1918. And so many people consider that Western Armenia, where the Western Armenians are from, even though, by legal borders, it's not within Armenia's borders, but it is where we're from. So that's what I mean. Modern Armenia is the Armenia that's left today. Now, also from Turkey, we have baptismal records of St. Grigor Savarit's Church of Gesaria or Kayseri, going back to 1902. And now a really great one, which helped me out, is Armenian Catholic records for the churches of Ankara since 1830. I have an Armenian Catholic ancestors from Ankara, and I've looked over those records in depth. They don't have every single person that I was looking for born in those dates. However, it had tons of people I'd never heard of, 1840s, 1850s, but they had my family last name, and it says who the parents are, and you can kind of put together trees of these families based on that. It's not the original records. What happened is it seems that, so there were at least 5 Armenian Catholic churches, about 4 or 5 in Ankara on the eve of the genocide. And it seems like someone knew it was happening and what was going on, and they wrote really fast because it's very hard to read, very sloppy, but they wrote all of this information and they noted which church it was. I think there's 3 different ones that they were notating the records for. So it will tell you the name of the person, what their parents' names were, when they were baptized, which was probably a couple of days after they were born, so you know their approximate birth date, and what church they were baptized in. So that information made it to Istanbul. The rest of the churches were all burned down in 1916. Once the genocide got the Armenians out, they burned the Armenian quarter of Ankara and many other cities, and they built the modern capital of Ankara, of Turkey, on the Armenian district. So very symbolic. The new Turkish state is built on top of the ruins of the Armenian town. So that's another helpful one. But again, it's a very, most people here do not have Catholic ancestors from Ankara, but it is another example of what is out there, and maybe there's more out there that hasn't been found. DNA is really important because it can tell you who your relatives maybe are and find links. I have never really yet been able to draw a connection between someone I didn't already know was related that matched me because the matches weren't close enough. But it will tell you, you will know, all right, they are about fifth or sixth cousins. But it's always like that one generation away. If I could go back one more generation, I'd probably be able to link to them, but I can't quite get there. But that said, it's the DNA tests are not just about you're 50% Irish or 100% Armenian or whatever. That's what most people know it for, but it's much better when it comes to telling you who you match with and to what degree in the database. And if you have a parent around or grandparent, that's even better. Get them tested because they have even more DNA going further back than you do. Every generation, splits half, half, half. So we'll go real quick through the rest. Anyone with Syrian ancestry? Unfortunately, very little was microfilmed in 1988 when the Mormon Church did go there and got a little bit. And who knows how much of it's been destroyed in the war in the past 10 years. But they do have baptism records from 1843 to 1937, which would be very helpful. Many refugees ended up in Aleppo at that time. Marriage records at Holy 40 Martyrs Church, 1878 to 1900. Not a very big period, but it's something. We have the Ottoman census for 1848. And there were a bunch of Armenians from places like like Arapkir, that were settling in Syria at the time. So they do show up. Lebanon, we have midwife records. Midwives that start out in Aintab, and they then went to Aleppo and then ended up in Beirut. And they were all along the way. They were writing down the babies that were born. And so you never know who you might find in there. St. Nishon Church, if you happen to have ancestors that went to that particular one, they have sacrament records going as far back as 1863. There's 3 church censuses done from the mid 20th century, so the names of all the members. And then there's a convenient index for baptism records. The index is important. Some of these records you can't even, you'd have to look through every single name. It's not indexed, to find somebody. But baptisms from 1903, marriage in 1934, and death all the way back to 1869 are indexed. So that's really helpful. The LDS Church, their genealogy centers can help you with that. Greece was an important place for Armenian refugees because so many passed through there. Some settled there. There were orphanages there. Many it's the closest place to Turkey. So their first stop was in Greece. There's funeral records for St. Godebed's Church of Crete, which goes back to 1669. And then various refugee lists from 1923, and some of them did go on to the US. Egypt, Cairo, 1906 to 1907. They did a census of the Armenians of Cairo during that time. I found 1 or 2 ancestors in it who had left Turkey, and before coming to America, they stopped in Cairo. So they're actually in that. So it helped me out. It didn't tell me anything that I didn't know, but just to see them in there. And it tells you what neighborhood they lived in. That added a bit of detail for me. I've been told they lived in Alexandria, and maybe they did, but they were there in the Cairo census. So that did actually tell me something I didn't realize. 4,000 people in it. Again, this one was transcribed as well. And so that information's online. We have St. Krikolusarich Church starting from 1893. And then this Zakazig, Egypt, and the Nile Delta, the records are 1864. And then there's more Armenian Catholic records that exist for Alexandria since the 1800s. Somebody asks, were most Armenians Catholic? The answer is no. That's why that Ankara record will help most people. But there was a small percentage of them in Ankara, especially. About 70% of Armenians from Ankara were Catholic, but that is a very rare high number. Most other places, not so much. So that is about it, and we're kind of right up on time. So if anyone has any questions they want to ask live, feel free, or any feedback. But thank you all for listening, and I hope you learned something. I can always help you if you're trying to get into just how this all works out. If you haven't done it much before, and there's also the Armenian Genealogy group on Facebook, which I highly recommend. People there are amazing in how helpful they are. They've helped lots of people, even that had adoptive parents and didn't know who their parents were. They discovered they're Armenian, or that maybe their father wasn't who they thought it was, and it was actually an Armenian. I mean, people are learning every day that they're Armenian and had no idea. So there's a lot of amazing things going on there. They're helping tons of people find their ancestors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. This was so interesting. I hope everybody learned something like amazing. I know I did. And are there any questions before we call it a night?
Any records from Palestine, Jerusalem? There are some records that are held at the Patriarchate. In addition, there were some records which had been moved out of Turkey. Some of the Patriarch's records were actually moved out of Istanbul to Jerusalem. And some people had said that it was like, vital records of births and censuses, but I've also heard that's not really the case, and they what they have is not totally clear to me. There is something online written by George Alkjayan about Armenian records from Israel. I tried Googling that. It was published in the Armenian Weekly. So check out that article. It does list what is available for Israel, but in a lot of cases, we don't even know what's there. For example, George is kind of been the first one to go through the records of the first Armenian Republic, which 1918 and 1920, which got sent over to Boston, and also that's the ARF records as well. And they've got tons of stuff in there, but he's just starting. As in, he's been doing it for years, but he's just scratching the surface of what they have in there. So, and all of that, there's nowhere that's not recorded on Ancestry or online anywhere what is in there. So in the years to come, hopefully that stuff will go online and become more accessible. But like we're saying, there's so much that we still don't know what is even out there. So you never know. Even if there's nothing seems to have your ancestors in it right now, that doesn't mean that it will never show up.
Awesome. Mark has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. Couple questions. This has been very enlightening. Thank you for sharing all that, especially all the ship records. I was not aware that was available.
Yeah.
I'm new to the genealogy. I have a couple questions. One is that there's when it comes to DNA, there's something called, I think, the Armenian DNA Project, something like that. Is that the I think Family DNA?
Family Tree DNA, that's right.
Family Tree DNA, thank you. And I'm wondering if there's any, if you have any information about that, and whether that's a worthwhile thing for people to participate in that project. And then my second question was about there's groups that have been having like an Armenian Genealogy conference once a year the past few years. I'm wondering if you know if there's any genealogy conference scheduled for this year.
Well, I've been to a couple. I went to the New Jersey one, which I believe was 2019, and then COVID shut things down. And then I was at one in Yerevan, 2022. That was this past fall. I haven't heard about plans for the next one. However, I assume that they will be forthcoming. The last one was in the fall, so maybe we could see one in this fall. Now, it's George Alkjayan who's been the one who's been putting a lot of that on. He really organized the one in Yerevan, so we could get you in contact with him. He's on Facebook too, if you have Facebook. Just add him, and he gets people asking questions about genealogy all the time. So yes, it's very interesting. They also, I believe, they probably will stream it online. So if you can't visit the actual site, you can watch some of the presentations usually. And you also mentioned about the Armenian DNA project. George has been involved with that as well, as you can imagine. And he actually has been going to the extent of, before COVID especially, he was traveling to Turkey quite often meeting with hidden Armenians, as they're called, and trying to get them DNA. And because he was actually able, thanks to a random Turkish person who matched him very closely using that DNA site. He hadn't, that wasn't someone he tested. This is just someone who was interested in DNA, took the test, and it ended up being like a very, very close relative, to the point where he knew that this person doesn't exist on my family tree, and they would be here if I knew who they were. And it ended up tracing it, that he had his grandmother, I believe, had a sister who had vanished during the genocide, and they had thought that she had died, but in fact, she was taken in by a Turkish family, as happened to many, many people. So many of your, especially female relatives, who, you know, it's just died, we assume, in the genocide. They might not have, and she had children with them, and these are the descendants of them. And so he's met with very close relatives in Turkey who were open to meeting him. You know, people sometimes are afraid. I've heard from a lot of Armenians actually that are afraid to take it because they either are afraid they'll find out they're Turkish, which is not a thing, first of all. The DNA, it does not, there's no such thing as Armenian DNA that, like, you know, it's going to tell you you are 100% Armenian. It's more, it's an algorithm that looks at, okay, in the past tests information that we have, Armenians show up with these types of markers. And so the odds are you're like Armenian, but that could also be Assyrian. That could be, you know, someone, you know, whatever other, you know, groups from the region, people, ancestors from that, even further afield, going back thousands of years. It's that part, you know, is, but it's how close of a relative is what really matters. And then all they're afraid of finding out that, like, they have a Turkish relative. Well, I mean, most Armenians do because of the genocide experience. We just don't know who they are. It's not that Armenians usually have Turkish ancestry, because Armenians had to keep to themselves. They could not marry a Turk. Some Armenians would convert, especially to escape persecution. They would become Muslims. And in that case, then they would be intermarrying with the Muslims, but they were no longer Armenian. So these are Armenian DNA getting injected into Turkish or Kurdish families, but there was almost never an example because it wasn't allowed. You know, a Turkish woman, for example, could not marry a Christian. So it's the Armenians that are, you know, pure. Not that anyone is pure anything. That's a false notion in itself. Whereas it's the Turks that generally have the very, very mixed ancestry. But it's worthwhile because it's seeking to make a resource, a reference point. If you had taken the DNA tests in the past 5 to 10 years, because they've gotten better about it recently, but they used to have, Armenians were always showing up as like 10% Jewish constantly. And that is because there's been a lot of DNA research and studies on Jewish DNA. It has more support. It's something more of general interest. And frankly, you know, the funding was there for those types of projects. There's never been funding for Armenian DNA. There are no, you know, real big studies of Armenian DNA. So when the DNA algorithms were looking at what was in their stuff, they saw I had a lot of, you know, Jewish tests, and so they would find occasional reference points in Armenians, because go back 5,000 years. I mean, it's all, you know, it's all the same area, but that doesn't mean that you're related to them or that you're Jewish or anything. So Armenians were showing up as Jewish, and it caused a lot of confusion. But now they're getting better. They've kind of started to work it down, and the Armenian DNA Project is meant to be a resource for that. So someone who is doing a study can look at that and say, all right, here is a large population of Armenians. You know, it's, instead of having to pay for a study to gather that and collect it, you just got it right there. And what my advice is for people to do is to test with one or both, if you have the ability, of the major ones, Ancestry and 23andMe. They usually go on sale every so often, kind of wait for a sale. The price is averages around $100. Could be less, especially if it's a sale. Maybe wait for that. If you can get both, it's better because you're going to only match with the people in that one database. So you're going to match whoever's in Ancestry and match whoever's in 23, but you don't get, if you only have yours in Ancestry, you're never going to know if you have a match in 23. Next, what you should do is once you do that, you can download your information, your DNA into a file and upload it for free to the Family Tree DNA site. Once you upload it there, you can join it to the Armenian DNA project. So you're included in that, and you get to see more matches for free through that website. So someone who is on, Ancestry and maybe, and you're on 23andMe, but if they're on Family Tree DNA, you'll see matches there, or they might be from a whole other website. The great thing about Family Tree DNA is that they let people upload for free. So it becomes kind of a repository for people from lots of different sites. So if you haven't gotten both DNA tests, it's fine, but you might find a match on there. There's also a couple other websites like that where you can upload for free as well. And overall, though, the main thing you're looking for is those close relatives. You'll find lots of them that are, the measure of closest is called centimorgan, CM. If you've got someone that's like 8 to 10 to 15 range, there's the 8 to 10s might be flukes. They might not even be related to you at all. And then in the teens and the 20s, they might be extremely far distant, but it's probably too hard for you to even, know. You've got to have people that are in the 70s, 80s, especially the 100s or 200s. Then you're going to probably have something. So don't rush down every single match where you can reach out to every single person and hope to find out what the connection is. If they've got 10 centimorgans with you, there's not even worth even checking that out. But you never know who might be in there. In George's case, it was a very close relative that solved the whole family mystery of a century. So again, not everyone is ready for what comes up because, like I mentioned, some people have found out that their father wasn't their father, for example, which is difficult. So I guess we shouldn't take this lightly. The commercials make it seem so fun and whatever, but I mean, people have really been thrown for a loop when they learn that. And if you have any reason to believe, or even if you don't know what you'll find out. But they've discovered that they're Armenian, so that's kind of great in its own way too. And they've gotten, through the Armenian Genealogy group, they've started to learn about their culture or their biological culture, and so it opens up all new doors. People have met siblings, and it's a lot more common than you'd think. It's funny because it's with being Armenian, it's that whole idea of amotuchun and we don't do that kind of thing. And well, I mean, I even had someone that I had them test in the Armenian DNA project, and she discovered a very, very close relative that, again, did not exist. And it turns out the only possible person it could have been was an uncle who, before being married, seems he had something, and you don't know if he even knew he had a child or not, but the child was born, the child was told it had a certain father, but as we learn now, actually wasn't. And she met the grandchild of that person. So basically her first cousin, once removed, she met that they never knew existed. So anyway, I'm going on a bit long, but as you can tell, there's a lot of interesting stuff that can show up. But it's important to us as Armenians that we preserve that DNA if we can, because it's been all lost by the genocide. We don't know who our ancestors were, and this is a way of reclaiming family.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. We're going to have this recording up on our website, the Burbank Public Library website, in a little bit. So keep an eye out for it if you want to, review any of this. Thank you, Paul.
Yes, if you have any questions for me later on, you can always contact me. My email is vartan, VARTAN 84 @gmail.com. And one more shout out I want to give to is there's another Armenian DNA project besides that one. There is one, the Armenian DNA Atlas, which seeks people who have 4 grandparents from the same place in historical or modern Armenia. They have certain places that they're still looking for, Arapgir and Malatya being 2 of them, but there's about 20 different towns. I think Zeytun is another, Because what happened is we had Armenians living in, specific places. They had their own cultures, their own dialects, their own ways of life, and then the genocide blew everything up. Many of them were killed, but the ones who weren't killed were all sent into exile. And so here in America, for example, we're all even, if Armenians marry with Armenians, you're marrying with someone who might have, someone from that village, and then one way over there, and then another part of Armenia. Like a lot of people are, half Eastern Armenian, half Western Armenian. So our DNAs are being recombinated, which is great, but we're losing whatever that historical data was from, what did it mean if you were a Sivas Armenian? What was that? What were the differences in those DNAs versus an Armenian from another part of, historical Armenian? So if anyone watching this has grandparents or knows someone with grandparents from all four places, get in contact with me, and they'd love to do a swab of you so we can have this atlas of examples of, okay, this is what people with that DNA, what it was like before we lose it for good, because we've already lost, most of the people that had four grandparents from one place. So thanks for that.
Awesome. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. Good night.